Welcome back to our class, Genesis, the Conflict Over Creation. We're glad that you joined us to study how to handle and carefully interpret the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. Our instructor is James Rochford. In this episode, we will evaluate the Days of Divine Fiat interpretation of Genesis 1.
The Divine Fiat interpretation originated with F. Hugh Capron in 1902. However, Alan Hayward, a British engineer and physicist, was its most famous proponent. And yet, Alan Hayward himself belonged to a non-Christian sect called Christadelphianism, which denies the deity of Christ, denies salvation by grace through faith alone, and denies the penal substitutionary atonement of Jesus. So, needless to say, this view is not off to a good start. From this perspective, the 6 days of creation refer to God's perspective from heaven, not from earth. While God announced his decree over 6 consecutive 24-hour days in heaven, the results took place over indeterminate periods of time on earth. According to Hayward, God's commands are followed by parentheses, explaining the effect on earth. He writes this: Genesis is basically an account of the great creative fiats which were uttered upon the 6, presumably literal, consecutive days. Inserted into this primary narrative is a whole series of parentheses which describe the subsequent fulfillment of the fiats. The outworking of the fiats, of course, could have taken any amount of time to occur. The fiats of God are uttered swiftly, but his mills grind slowly. The corresponding events on earth could take time or even overlap with one another. Again, Hayward states, the broad similarity is because the creative processes were presumably started in much the same order as the daily fiats. The discrepancies are because those creative processes took varying lengths of time to complete, so that there would be a great deal of overlapping in the periods of active creation. So, just to summarize, Hayward's view is that God spoke and commanded these creative events from heaven in 6 literal consecutive days. And yet, the events on earth could have happened billions of years later, or they could have happened in an overlapping way, or they could have started and then completed at other different times. The focus is on God's commands from heaven, and the events on earth are only consequences of his heavenly decrees. While this view is interesting at first glance, it completely removes the events of Genesis from history. However, Genesis interacts with actual events on earth, not in heaven. The biggest critique of Hayward's view is that the heavenly realm isn't even mentioned in Genesis chapter 1. Only God is mentioned. By contrast, God is seen as a theophany walking through the garden on earth in Genesis 3:8. Simply nothing in the text sets the passage in heaven. Rather, the setting is on earth. Therefore, it is for this reason that we do not adhere to the divine fiat interpretation.